The courtroom was silent. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the weight of an unseen truth pressed against the walls. Judge Richard Caldwell had faced countless cases, broken families, shattered trust, parents who abandoned, and children who suffered. He had ruled with a steady hand, always believing in justice, always certain of his judgments. But today was different. Today, an 8-year-old boy stood before him, his small frame rigid, his hands clenched around a worn photograph. The edges were frayed, the ink slightly faded, but the image was unmistakable. Richard felt his breath catch. Then the boy spoke. "You abandoned me." 3 words, small, sharp, and more damning than any verdict Richard had ever delivered. The gavel slipped from his grip, crashing against the wooden desk. The sound echoed through the courtroom, but the world had already crumbled around him. The boy's eyes bored into him with an accusation no law could erase. And for the first time in his life, Judge Richard Caldwell realized he was the guilty one. Judge Richard Caldwell had spent 15 years ruling over the lives of others, presiding over broken families, custody battles, and endless legal disputes. He had seen parents stripped of their rights, children torn between homes, and families shattered beyond repair. But never had he imagined he would become one of those cases himself. It was a late morning in courtroom 307. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. The atmosphere held the usual formality, the weight of justice looming in every corner. Then, something shifted. Maybe it was the silence, the kind that felt unnatural, as if the very walls knew something was about to unfold. Or maybe it was the small boy sitting in the front row, his presence commanding attention despite his size. 8-year-old Elijah Carter sat perfectly still, his small frame nearly swallowed by the massive wooden bench. His foster care lawyer, Sarah Mitchell, sat beside him, occasionally glancing at the boy with thinly veiled concern. The rigid posture, the hollow expression, the way he clutched that old photograph, all spoke of years of weight no child should carry. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Richard Caldwell." The announcement rang through the chamber. The side door opened, and Judge Caldwell entered, his black robe flowing behind him, his movements precise and practiced. At 42, he was a man of absolute control, his presence unwavering, his judgments firm. But as he stepped onto the bench and his gaze swept across the courtroom, he paused just for a fraction of a second. Something was wrong. His eyes landed on the boy, and the boy stared back. A strange unease settled in Richard's stomach. The boy's gaze was piercing, too old for his young face. There was something eerily familiar about it, something that made his pulse falter. In Elijah's small hands, he clutched something, an old photograph. The paper was worn, creased at the edges from being held too many times. But even from across the room, Richard could make out the image. His own face. A younger version of himself, frozen in time, standing beside a woman whose memory hit him like a ghost from the past. Naomi Carter. The name on the case file before him blurred in his vision. His breath hitched. His throat went dry. For a moment, he couldn't move, couldn't speak, as something inside him twisted violently. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be possible. "Be seated," he commanded, his voice steady despite the turmoil rising in his chest. He forced himself to look at the case file again, scanning the words with deliberate care. In the matter of Elijah Carter permanent placement hearing, Sarah Mitchell rose from her seat. "Your Honor, we are here today regarding the permanent placement of Elijah Carter, currently in the foster care system. Elijah has been in temporary placement for 4 years now, and we're seeking to finalize a permanent arrangement." Richard barely heard her. His mind was racing, his past colliding with his present in ways he couldn't comprehend. He turned the page. The mother's name, Naomi Carter. The courtroom seemed to spin. The gavel in his hand felt foreign, like it belonged to someone else. His heart pounded against his ribs as fragments of memory came, crashing back: a woman's laughter, dark eyes that crinkled at the corners, whispered promises under dim streetlights. But Naomi was gone. She had left, moved on, married someone else. Hadn't she? His hands trembled slightly as he turned another page, searching for any logical explanation, and then he saw the dates, the timeline, the truth. His entire world shifted. Before Richard could find his voice, a different one cut through the air. Small, sharp as a blade, filled with years of pain. "You abandoned me." The words were a gunshot to the chest. Every head in the courtroom turned toward their source. Elijah had risen to his feet, his small frame shaking with emotion, the photograph crumpling slightly in his tight grip. Richard felt something inside him break. "What did you say?" His voice barely came out. Elijah's gaze didn't waver. His lips trembled, but his words came clearer, stronger. "You left me and my mom. You never came back." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Gasps, whispers. The social worker half rose from her seat, reaching for Elijah. But the boy wasn't finished. "Mom cried every night," he continued, tears now streaming down his face. "She waited for you. She always waited. Even when she got sick, she said maybe you'd come back." Richard gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles white. The revelation hit him like a tidal wave, drowning him in a truth too cruel to accept. This boy, this broken, hurting child was his son. The child he never knew existed. The child he had abandoned without even knowing it. The courtroom was no longer a courtroom. It was a reckoning. Richard Caldwell, the esteemed judge, the upholder of justice, had just been sentenced. And his punishment? Living with the truth that he had failed, the only case that had ever truly mattered. Judge Richard Caldwell sat frozen behind his bench. His world, once structured, logical, and meticulously controlled, had shattered in a single moment. The gavel lay abandoned on the desk, his authority meaningless against the weight of truth crushing down on him. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, a storm of whispers swirling around him. His Sanhee's flesh and blood stood there, broken but unyielding, his eyes filled with an emotion Richard had seen in countless children but never imagined directed at himself. Betrayal. Elijah Carter had lived his entire life believing one truth. His father had abandoned him. And now, Richard was being judged not by the court, not by the law, but by the son he had unknowingly forsaken. His throat was dry, his voice barely above a whisper. "Elijah." But the boy took a step back, his fingers tightening around the worn photograph, as if afraid Richard might try to take it from him, take the last piece of his mother he had left. The court clerk, Mr. Peterson, hesitated before clearing his throat. "Your Honor, should we?" "Call Judge Harrison," Richard said suddenly, his voice hoarse. "Immediately. I need to recuse myself from this case." He couldn't preside over his own son's hearing. He couldn't be impartial. Hell, he could barely breathe. Mr. Peterson hurried out of the courtroom, and Richard forced himself to look at Sarah Mitchell, Elijah's lawyer. She had recovered from the shock faster than most, but there was something in her expression, a calculated wariness, as if she had expected something like this. "Miss Mitchell." Richard's voice cracked, and he swallowed hard, trying to regain his composure. "Did you know?" Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line. "I had my suspicions, Your Honor." "Your Honor." The title felt like a mockery now. Richard's grip on the desk tightened. "Why wasn't I notified?" Sarah's gaze flickered to Elijah, who refused to look at him. The boy had retreated into himself, his face blank, his fingers tracing the photograph in his hands. "Because Naomi tried," she said simply. "Again and again she wrote letters, made phone calls. She did everything she could to reach you." Richard's stomach twisted violently. "I never got any letters," he rasped. Sarah's expression didn't change. "Number you didn't." Because someone close to him had made sure he never saw them. His parents, James and Elizabeth Caldwell. The realization hit him like a second betrayal layered on top of the first. They had lied to him, manipulated him, told him that Naomi had moved on, that she had married someone else, that she had disappeared from his life by choice. And had blindly obedient, a fool had believed them. The sound of approaching footsteps snapped Richard back into the present. The side door opened, and Judge Margaret Harrison entered, her usual air of efficiency tempered by the gravity of the situation. She took one glance at Richard's ashen face, and Elijah's tear-streaked one, and immediately understood. "You're recusing yourself?" she asked, wasting no time. "Yes." "Granted," she said without hesitation. "We'll recess until I've reviewed the case files. In the meantime, Elijah will be taken back to his foster placement." The words sent a cold chill down Richard's spine. Elijah had already suffered enough in the system, had already been shuffled between homes, each one leaving deeper scars. "Wait," Richard spoke before he could think. "Can I—" His voice faltered as he looked at Elijah, who still wouldn't meet his gaze. "Can I speak to him?" The courtroom fell into a tense silence. Elijah's shoulders stiffened. His fingers dug into the photograph. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out of the courtroom, his social worker at his side. Richard felt the loss like a physical blow. The one chance he had to say something and he had already lost it. The courthouse was nearly empty. The distant echo of voices in the hallways was the only sound breaking the suffocating silence in Richard's chambers. He sat at his desk, his fingers gripping the edges, as he stared at the manila folder before him. Elijah Carter's case file. A child who had been abandoned, moved from home to home. A child who had stopped talking after his third foster placement. A child who had been through so much, and now Richard knew why. Because his father had failed him. His own name was printed in ink on a dozen documents. Naomi Carter's name too. And suddenly, Richard wasn't just a judge looking at a case file. He was a man reading the story of a life he had missed. He flipped through the pages, his breath growing unsteady. A hospital report. Naomi's death certificate. His hands trembled as he read the cause. Cancer. It felt like a noose tightening around his throat. She had been sick, dying, and still, she had waited for him. Still, she had tried to reach him. Richard squeezed his eyes shut, his fingers pressing against the bridge of his nose. How many nights had she cried herself to sleep, whispering his name? How many times had Elijah asked about the father who never came? A sudden wave of rage surged through him, not at Naomi, not even at himself, but at his parents. They had taken everything from him. His love, his family, his son. Richard grabbed his phone and dialed his father's number with shaking fingers. It rang twice before James Caldwell's smooth, controlled voice answered. "I'm in a meeting." Richard's breathing was ragged. "You knew." A pause, then a sigh. "Richard, you knew about my son." Silence. Everything was unraveling now. The deception, the carefully constructed lies. "We did what was best for you," James finally said. "That girl. Her name was Naomi," Richard roared, slamming his fist against the desk. "And she was dying. She was raising our son alone while you sat there and fed me lies." James's voice hardened. "You had a future, Richard. One that didn't involve some—" Richard cut him off. "You stole my family from me." His voice dropped deadly quiet. "You stole my son." More silence. Then James said, "You have a choice to make, Richard. You can either move forward and let this go, or you can destroy everything you've built trying to fix a past that's already dead." Richard's grip on the phone tightened until his knuckles turned white. He had made his choice the moment Elijah walked into that courtroom. "I won't lose him again," Richard said, his voice like steel. "And I don't care what I have to do, I will make this right." This wasn't about his reputation. This wasn't about revenge. This was about a father fighting for his son. And this time, he wouldn't fail him. The night felt heavier than usual. The walls of Richard Caldwell's home, once symbols of success and stability, now suffocated him like a prison of his own making. His parents had stolen everything from him, his love, his family, his son, and he had let them. Elijah was out there, somewhere in another cold, impersonal foster home, believing his father had abandoned him. But not anymore. Richard Caldwell was going to fix this no matter what it took. At the crack of dawn, Richard arrived at his office, his first day back since his world had shattered. His presence was met with hushed whispers and stolen glances. The courthouse staff had clearly read the headlines. Respected judge discovers abandoned son in his own courtroom. He ignored them. None of their opinions mattered. Only Elijah did. Sarah Mitchell was already waiting for him, sitting across from his desk with a folder in front of her. her expression unreadable. "I assume you've read the reports," she said. Richard sat down, his chest tight. "Every page." She nodded. "Then you know the system has failed him. Again and again." The memories from Elijah's case file haunted Richard. The abuse, the neglect, the endless cycle of moving from home to home, never belonging, never feeling wanted. "I want custody," Richard said, his voice firm. Sarah's brow arched slightly, but she didn't look surprised. "That won't be easy, given your history with Elijah, his emotional state, and he's my son." "That may be true, but legally you're a stranger to him." Sarah's tone wasn't cruel, just realistic. "You've never been a part of his life. He doesn't trust you, and trust isn't something that can be ordered by a judge." Richard's jaw clenched. "Then tell me what I need to do." Sarah sighed and leaned forward, lacing her fingers together. "You need to prove to the court, and more importantly to Elijah, that you're not just showing up now out of guilt, that you're committed, that you'll stay." "I will," Richard said without hesitation, "for as long as it takes." Sarah studied him for a long moment before nodding. "All right, then let's start with the first step. You need to see him." The Maplewood Children's Home was a clean, well-kept facility, but Richard could see the loneliness behind its orderliness. It wasn't a home. A staff member led him into a small visitation room. The walls were painted yellow, but they did little to warm the atmosphere. A table sat in the center, a single chair on either side. Richard sat, waiting. His heart pounded as the door opened. Elijah walked in. The boy was still small, still quiet, but Richard noticed how rigid his posture was, like he was preparing for disappointment. His son sat across from him without a word. His hands were folded tightly in his lap, and his mother's photograph was placed in front of him like a barrier. Richard swallowed hard, trying to find the right words. But Elijah spoke first. "Why are you here?" His voice was sharp, untrusting. Richard exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Because I should have been here a long time ago." Elijah didn't react. He just stared at him, unreadable. "You left," the boy said finally. "You weren't there. Mom waited for you, but you never came." Richard's chest tightened. He wanted to explain, to defend himself, but Sarah had warned him. This wasn't about justifying the past. It was about proving the future. So instead he said, "You're right." Elijah blinked, caught off guard. "I should have been there," Richard continued. "I didn't know the truth, but I should have fought harder to find it. I should have found you." Silence. Elijah's fingers tightened around the photograph, but he didn't look away. Richard hesitated, then pulled something from his pocket. He placed it gently on the tabla compass pendant on a silver chain. "What's that?" Elijah asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Richard took a deep breath. "A compass, so you'll always know you can find your way home." Elijah's hands twitched as if he wanted to reach for it, but instead he clenched them into fists. "I don't have a home," he muttered. Richard's heart broke. "You do," he said softly, "whenever you're ready." Elijah stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I don't believe you," he said. "They all say that. They all leave." Richard's throat tightened. He wanted to reach for him, to promise again and again that he wasn't going anywhere. But trust couldn't be forced. It had to be earned. Elijah grabbed the compass, shoving it into his pocket. "You should go." Richard nodded, his heart hammering with unspoken words. "I'll be back," he promised. Elijah didn't respond as he turned and left the room. The battle for Elijah was just beginning. The next week was filled with legal motions, psychological evaluations, and meetings with social workers. The state wouldn't just hand Elijah over. They wanted proof that Richard could provide stability. And worse, his father, James Caldwell, had filed a motion to block the custody petition. "He's emotionally unstable," his father's lawyer had argued. "He abandoned his judicial post in a public spectacle. How can the court trust him with a traumatized child?" Richard kept his anger in check. His father had taken everything from him once. He wouldn't let it happen again. But the real challenge wasn't the court. It was Elijah. No matter what legal battle Richard won, it meant nothing if his son didn't want to come home. Another week passed before Richard saw Elijah again. This time, the boy was wearing the compass pendant. It wasn't much, but it was something. Did you mean it? Elijah asked the moment he sat down. Richard frowned. Mean what? That you'll keep coming back? Elijah said, his voice hesitant. Richard's chest ached. Yes. Elijah stared at him, searching for any sign of a lie. After a long moment, he pulled something from his pocket. A letter. Richard's breath hitched. Elijah's voice was quiet, almost fragile. Mom wrote this to you, but you never got it. Richard's hands trembled as he took it. Naomi's words, frozen in time. Our son needs you. Please, if you ever loved me, find your way back to him. Richard swallowed hard, his vision blurring. I found you, he whispered, and I won't lose you again. For the first time, Elijah didn't look away. For the first time, Richard saw something in his eyes, other than pain. Hope. The day of the custody hearing arrived with a tension so thick it was suffocating. Richard stood outside Courtroom 207, his hands clenched into fists, his heart hammering in his chest. Inside, his entire future hung in the balance. Not his career, not his reputation, but his son. Elijah was still inside the foster system, still living in a temporary home, still unsure if he could trust his father. And now, Richard had to veto the court, to the system, and most of all to Elijah that he wasn't going anywhere. But standing in his way was James Caldwell, the man who had orchestrated the greatest lie of Richard's life, the man who had stolen his son's childhood, the man who would rather see Elijah raised by strangers than acknowledge his own mistakes. Richard inhaled sharply, steadying himself. This fight wasn't about winning. It was about deserving Elijah's trust. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, lawyers, court officials, everyone had come to watch the battle. Judge Harrison sat at the bench, her sharp gaze moving between Richard, Sarah Mitchell, and James Caldwell's high-priced attorney, Thomas Bradford. Elijah sat at the far side of the room with his social worker, Miss Roberts. The boy didn't look at Richard, but he was wearing the compass pendant. It was the only sign of hope Richard had. The bailiff called the court to order, and Judge Harrison got straight to business. We're here today to determine the custodial placement of Elijah Carter, she said, her voice crisp. Mr. Caldwell, as the biological father, is petitioning for full custody. Mr. James Caldwell has filed an opposition to this petition, citing concerns over Mr. Caldwell's emotional and psychological fitness. Sarah Mitchell stood first. Your Honor, my client is Elijah's father, a child who has been lost in the foster system for 4 years. My client had no knowledge of his son's existence due to deliberate deception and interference. He now seeks to make up for lost time, provide a stable home, and rebuild the bond that was stolen from them. She gestured to Richard. My client has undergone psychological evaluations, home assessments, and parental training. He has shown commitment to Elijah, visiting him every day despite Elijah's hesitations. This is not a man looking for an easy fix. This is a father fighting for his child. Bradford stood. Your Honor, while the emotional aspects of this case are certainly compelling, the reality is far more concerning. Richard's stomach tightened. Here it comes. Bradford picked up a thick file of court transcripts. My client, James Caldwell, wishes to enter into evidence a record of Mr. Caldwell's previous judicial rulings, specifically the ones regarding parental fitness in custody cases. Judge Harrison frowned. Explain. Bradford smirked. Your Honor, Mr. Caldwell has a long history of ruling against parents, with histories of instable parents who failed to be there when their children needed them. We believe his own rulings should be applied to this case. He pulled out a highlighted transcript. Here's a direct quote from one of Mr. Caldwell's past cases, he said smoothly. He began to read. A parent who has been absent for years cannot expect to re-enter a child's life without consequence. A child's well-being must come before biological ties. The burden of proof is not on the child to accept a parenthood, is on the parent to prove they deserve a place in that child's life. The words felt like a knife to the gut. The same words Richard had spoken in his courtroom now being used against him. Bradford turned to Judge Harrison. Your Honor, By Mr. Caldwell's own legal standards, he has failed to prove his fitness as a parent. He was absent from his son's life for 8 years. His emotional outburst in the courtroom when he learned the truth. Richard's fists clenched. Shows he is unstable. His resignation from the bench is evidence of impulsivity and emotional distress. Bradford turned back to Richard, his eyes cold. He may feel guilty, Your Honor, but guilt does not make a good father. Silence filled the courtroom. Does the child have anything to say? Judge Harrison asked, looking at Elijah. Miss Roberts leaned down, whispering gently to him. Elijah hesitated. For a moment, Richard thought he wouldn't speak. Then, slowly, Elijah stood. He walked to the witness stand, his small hands gripping the compass pendant. Judge Harrison leaned forward. Elijah, you don't have to speak if you don't want to, but if you do, I'd like to hear how you feel. Elijah's voice was quiet. He keeps coming back. Bradford frowned. Excuse me? Elijah lifted his gaze, his dark eyes unreadable. He keeps coming back, the boy repeated. Even when I don't talk, even when I'm mad. The courtroom fell silent. Elijah's voice grew stronger. You don't know what it's like, he said, looking straight at Bradford. To have people tell you they care, and then they leave. Again and again. Foster homes, social workers, everyone. His fingers tightened around the compass. But he doesn't leave. Elijah turned to look at Richard for the first time since entering the courtroom. I don't know if I can trust him, he admitted. I don't know if I can ever trust anyone. Richard's chest ached. But I want to try. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Bradford froze. James Caldwell's face drained of color. Judge Harrison tapped her gavel lightly. Thank you, Elijah, she said gently. You may step down. Elijah walked back to his seat, but he didn't let go of the compass. Judge Harrison reviewed the case files, her expression unreadable. Finally, she looked at Richard. This is not an easy case, she admitted. Family law rarely is, but the law is clear. A parent's responsibility is not just to provide, but to prove they are capable of emotional stability and commitment. She paused. In his own rulings, Mr. Caldwell has set a high standard for parental responsibility. I expect him to meet it. Richard held his breath. Judge Harrison's eyes softened slightly. I believe he will. She lifted the gavel. Custody will be granted to Mr. Caldwell on a provisional basis, with ongoing social worker supervision. A final decision will be made after 6 months of observed stability. The gavel fell. It was done. Richard exited the courthouse, feeling like he could finally breathe. Elijah walked beside him. He didn't take Richard's hand, didn't smile. But as they reached the car, Elijah looked up at him. His voice was small. What happens now? Richard knelt down to his son's level. Now, he said softly, we take this one day at a time. Elijah hesitated. Then, slowly, he nodded. It wasn't trust. Not yet. But it was a beginning. Elijah stood at the doorway of Richard's house, staring at it like it was a foreign land. It wasn't his first time there. But it was the first time it was supposed to feel like home. Richard carried Elijah's 2 small boxes inside, aware of every hesitant step his son took behind him. The weight of reality pressed down on them both. They had won the court battle. But now came the harder part. Building something that neither of them truly knew how to build. Richard led Elijah inside, setting his bags down in the hallway. You can pick any room, he said gently, or we can design a new one together, whatever makes you comfortable. Elijah barely responded. His eyes flickered around the house, taking in the unfamiliar space. Richard noticed the way his son's fingers clenched around the compass pendant. I made a room for you, Richard said, voice careful. You don't have to use it, but it's there. Elijah hesitated. Then, without a word, he followed Richard down the hallway. Richard opened the door, stepping aside so Elijah could see. The room was simple, undecorated, but prepared. A bed with fresh sheets. A bookshelf filled with stories. A small desk with an empty notebook. And on the nightstand a framed, restored copy of the photograph Elijah had carried through every foster home. His mother. And his father? Still whole. Still together. Elijah stared. For a moment, Richard thought he'd say something, but instead, Elijah turned away. Without a word, he walked out of the room and into the guest room down the hall. Richard didn't stop him. He just stood there, watching his son build another wall. That first night, Richard made dinner. Grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup. Naomi's comfort meal. Elijah picked at the food, ate in silence. Richard didn't push. Didn't force conversation. Didn't tell him he didn't have to earn his place here, because Elijah wouldn't believe him yet. It happened 3 nights later. The storm came out of nowhere, a thunder. Heavy rain, violent wind. Richard was in his office, reviewing legal files, until he heard the first crash. He rushed to the hallway, finding Elijah standing in the dark. A broken picture frame lay on the floor. Shattered glass. Naomi's photo face down. Elijah was shaking. His breathing shallow. "Hey," Richard said softly. "It's okay." Elijah backed up, his fists clenched. "No, it's not." His voice was tight. "None of this is okay." Richard kept his voice steady. "I know." "No, you don't," Elijah's voice cracked. "You don't know what it's like to wake up in a different house every year, to have people pretend they want you and then throw you away, to never have a home because you don't belong anywhere." Richard flinched. Elijah's chest heaved. "I don't know why I'm here," he whispered, voice breaking. "I don't know why you care now." Richard's heart ached. He knelt down, carefully gathering the shattered pieces of the frame. "I care," he said, his voice firm. "I care because you are my son." Elijah's eyes flashed with anger. "That doesn't mean anything. You weren't there when I needed you. You don't just get to show up and pretend." "I'm not pretending." Richard's voice never wavered. Elijah's fists clenched. "I hate you." Richard exhaled. His fingers curled around the broken frame. "That's okay," he said gently. "You can hate me." Elijah looked thrown off by the answer. "But I love you," Richard continued, "and that's not going to change." Elijah's jaw tightened, and then without another word, turned and ran to his guest room, slamming the door. Richard stood alone, with nothing but shattered glass and silence. The storm raged, and at 2 a.m., Richard heard the footsteps. Soft, hesitant. Richard sat up in bed, watching as Elijah stood in the doorway, his small frame outlined by the dim hallway light. "Can I?" Elijah hesitated. His fingers tightened on the compass. "Can I just sit here for a bit?" Richard didn't move. He just nodded. "Of course." Elijah slowly walked in. He didn't get in the bed. Didn't say anything else. He just sat on the floor. Silent. Small. And Richard let him. Because for the first time, Elijah had chosen to be near him. The next morning, Elijah was already awake. Sitting at the kitchen counter. Richard poured him coffee, half a cup, mostly milk, like Naomi used to make. Elijah took it without a word. And for the first time, as they sat there, the silence didn't feel so heavy. A week passed. Then, one morning as they drove to school, Elijah spoke. "Did you really want to be a judge?" Richard glanced at him. The question was so unexpected. Richard thought about lying, saying something safe. But then, he chose the truth. "No," Richard admitted. "I wanted to be a superhero." Elijah snorted. "You?" Richard smirked. "Hey, lawyers wear capes too sometimes." Elijah rolled his eyes. But for the first time, he almost smiled. That weekend, Richard found Elijah sitting in the living room, holding one of Naomi's letters. Richard's breath caught. Elijah looked up, his expression uncertain. "She wrote this the day I started school," he said quietly. "She said she wished you were there to walk me to class." Richard swallowed hard. "I would have," he whispered, "if I had known." Elijah hesitated. Then, for the first time, he held out the letter. "Will you read it with me?" Richard's hands shook slightly as he took the paper. And as he read his first memory of Elijah's childhood, he knew this was the first real step forward. Not trust, not forgiveness, but a step. And for now, that was enough. Elijah's steps were still hesitant, But something had changed. For the first time since he had walked into Richard's house, he wasn't just visiting, he was staying. The official adoption was done. The legal battle had ended. But the real battle of fight for trust, belonging, and love was still ongoing. And this was where it would either fall apart or finally come together. Richard knew one thing. He wouldn't fail this time. Boxes still lined the walls of Elijah's bedroom. He hadn't unpacked, hadn't let himself, because unpacking meant accepting, and accepting meant trusting. But tonight, Elijah stared at them. Something about the way they just sat there, closed and untouched, felt like they were holding him hostage. Slowly, he knelt beside the first box. His hands hovered over the flaps, hesitating, before he finally pulled it open. Inside he's mother's scarf. Soft, worn, still carrying a scent he wasn't sure was real anymore, or just memory playing tricks on him. Elijah swallowed hard. For the first time in a long time, he let himself miss her. Richard watched from the hallway, unseen, as Elijah began unpacking his life. No words, no pressure. Just a boy trying to decide if he could really have a home again. And as Richard stood there, he made a silent vow. No matter how long it took, Elijah would never feel abandoned again. Not by him. Not by anyone. The first time Richard truly felt like a father was Elijah's birthday. He had spent weeks planning. He wanted it to be perfect, not just a celebration, but a declaration that Elijah was no longer just a child surviving in a world that never wanted him. That he was home? So, Richard woke up before dawn, burning pancakes and filling the kitchen with smoke. Elijah walked in, rubbing his eyes. "Are you trying to poison me?" Richard laughed. "It's your mom's tradition, heart-shaped pancakes." Elijah froze. For a second, Richard thought he had ruined everything. But then Elijah just sat down and let Richard try again. This time, the pancakes weren't perfect, but they were good enough. And as they ate in silence, something shifted. Because Elijah had stayed, not just in the house, but in the moment. One night, Elijah walked into Richard's study. He was holding the photograph, the one of Naomi, the one he had protected for years. He looked up at Richard, and for the first time, there was no hesitation. I think I'm ready to put this on the wall." Richard's chest tightened. He nodded, standing. Together, they placed the photograph on the memory wall, right in the center. The foundation of their past, and a reminder that even though love gets lost sometimes, it always finds its way home. Months passed. The house no longer felt temporary. Elijah had started to talk more, laugh more, trust more. But Richard knew there was still one test left, and it came on a random afternoon. Elijah had broken a glass in the kitchen. Richard heard the crash and turned the corner just in time to see Elijah frozen in fear, his hands trembling, his breath short, because in the past, broken things had consequences. But Richard just walked forward, and instead of yelling, he knelt down. "Are you hurt?" he asked. Elijah blinked, surprised, then shook his head. Richard smiled gently. "Then it's just glass." Elijah stared at him, waiting, expecting something worse. But Richard just handed him a towel. "Come on, we'll clean it up together." For a long time, Elijah didn't move. Then, finally, he knelt down beside his father. And together, they picked up the pieces. One evening, as Richard tucked Elijah in, his son hesitated before speaking. "Dad?" Richard's heart skipped a beat. Elijah had called him that before, but this time was different. This time it sounded real. Richard sat beside him. "Yeah, buddy?" Elijah took a breath. Then, slowly, he reached into his nightstand and pulled out a small leather journal. "I've been writing stuff down," Elijah admitted, his fingers running over the cover. Richard waited. "I wrote something for Mom." He hesitated. Then, carefully, he handed Richard the open page. Richard read, "Dear Mom, I think you were right. He really did find his way back to me. And I think I found my way back too." That night, as Richard sat in his study, he looked at the photograph on the wall, the one that had started everything, and he whispered, so softly, only Naomi would hear it. I found him. I won't lose him again. And somewhere, he knew she was smiling, because Elijah was finally, truly home. And this time, he wasn't leaving. And this time, he wasn't leaving. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful tales of love, redemption, and second chances. Every family has a story, some lost, some broken, but all worth fighting for. If you believe in the strength of love, in the hope of healing, and in the power of never giving up, hit that subscribe button now. Let's keep sharing stories that matter, that remind us we are never truly alone. Because sometimes, love just needs to find its way home. Subscribe today because the next story might be the one you need to hear.